Kick off. Welcome everyone to our session today. I'm Annie from Charity So White, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-presenters Martha, Awojobi, Natalie, and Yvonne, also from Valley Initiative. We are really excited today to be doing this workshop with you and thinking about how we can, as a sector, lead the social good of the world. I think we are really grateful that you're here, and we take your presence in this session to mean that you understand that racism exists and that it is in our societies, our structures, and our work, and that you want to do and be better by being here. We think this has been a tough year for racialized groups in the sector, and the racial reckoning has made it impossible for anti-racism to be ignored, which is really, really important, and we're really hopeful for the future and what this can bring. Last year, we saw many funders and organisations post statements of solidarity and commitments to more equitable outcomes and processes. So today, you're here to make that goal a reality and embed this work in your strategic plans for the next however many years. And as you quarterly plan for the next 3-4 months, we really hope this takes the fore. We think it's critical to remember that we don't need to innovate around racism. We don't need innovation, we need action. We also need to recognise that the most innovative voices in this work aren't in this room, because they're in the communities that we support. And those communities, their voice should always be the focus and the centre of this. Martha is going to introduce some of the framing of anti-racism for us before passing on to Yvonne.
Thanks, Annie. Great opening. I already feel excited for change. So I think often we can have conversations about racism without really understanding what it is. And Charity So White uses an amazing framework called the 4 Eyes of Oppression, which can be applied to any form of oppression. But in this case, we'll be talking about racism. And I'm just going to whittle through them really quickly now so that we're all kind of working from the same standing point here. So the 4 Eyes of oppression are ideological racism, in this case, interpersonal racism, internalized racism, and institutional racism. And I'll go through each in turn. Ideological is all about belief systems. It's an innate belief in the idea of the superiority of your group. It's more intelligent, it's harder working, it's stronger, more capable, more noble, more deserving, advanced, and normal, right? And meanwhile, the opposite qualities are attributed to the oppressed group. They're lazy, they're weak, they're incompetent, less deserving, backwards, frightening, inferior. And it's the reason you might clutch your bag a little bit tighter when a black man comes towards you in the street. In the funding world, it looks like an assumption that organizations run by people of color do not know what is best for their communities, and that white orgs with no shared lived experience should be taking under that work. It looks like a devaluing of expertise. Interpersonal. It is only the really unacceptable form of racism in our society. It's how we reinforce racism in our day-to-day actions with each other, like racist jokes, microaggressions, those kinds of environmental communications that transmit a hostile, derogatory, negative message to a target group. It can look like, microaggressions or refusing to pronounce people's names properly. Internalized racism is when people of color internalize these negative messages about themselves from whiteness. It can look like imposter syndrome, not being able to bring your whole self to work. And it can lead to a perfectionism, and that can result in depression and burnout, especially for women of color. It's the reason why the skin bleaching industry, where people globally lighten their skin, using bleach to become closer to whiteness, is worth over $4.8 billion at the moment. And the biggie, institutional, the one I think that we're all here to talk about, is a socially acceptable form of racism. It's how racism is perpetuated through our societal structures, our laws, who has access to resource, housing opportunities, how people fare in the criminal justice system, and access to jobs. In the funding world, it can look like the underfunding of organizations led by Black and minoritized people. It can look like all white funding panels making decisions about money that's meant to be distributed to communities. Together, the 4 of these make up the system of racism. You need to have the ideological, the interpersonal, the internalized, and the institutional working together in order for the system of racism to be there. But that's a whistle-stop tour of racism. I feel like I could talk about it forever, but that's the framework with which Charities So White understand racism, and it's a really good way for you to kind of look at where racism exists in different aspects of your organisation. On that, I felt out of breath. I'm going to get through that really quickly. I will hand over to Yvonne.
Thank you, Martha, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people in this workshop this morning. My name's Yvonne Field, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Ubele Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do. I mean, it's just great for us to be co-hosting this workshop with Charities So White. Thank you for agreeing to collaborate with us on this, and it's really been brilliant through the design phase and just getting to know you a little bit more. But and also thanks to Natalie, who works with us at Ubele, for facilitating this and making this happen. So I'm really grateful for the collaborative effort that's ended up with this morning's workshop. And also just to say, part of our mission as Ubele is to create an intergenerational organisation. So I do feel very much the elder here. I don't know how I got in that position because the years have just whizzed by, but I'm really inspired by the next generation of activists and social justice activists, anti-racist activists. So I'm delighted to be on the platform with you this morning. I want to speak a bit about the work that we've been doing, particularly in relation to the funding field or world, because we know that it was a part of the wider system that was and still is quite stuck. It was very, very stuck, I think, and I believe, and that's been our experience, and that's been experience of many, many organisations around the country over the last 10, 15 years and more. But what's happened in the last year is there's been quite a considerable crack in the system, which started off with COVID and then was sort of sped up through the murder of George Floyd. And I think the murder of Dante White this week as well has actually continued to expose the ways in which systemic racism works. I'll talk a bit about the work we've been doing, and particularly around what I think is sort of emerging practice that we're learning from, and we continue to learn from that in terms of the work we've been trying to do in relation to funding and support to groups of Black and minoritized communities. But before I do that, I just wanted to tell you a little story. Well, it's quite a big story, but I haven't got time to tell you much about it. But actually next week is the 28th anniversary of Stephen Lawrence. And we kind of quote Stephen Lawrence in a way, I mean, sort of, I've heard, the term used, his name used. I'm not sure what it evokes when people hear it, but it sort of seems to be part of everyday language about racism and what the impact has been. But actually next week is the 28th anniversary, and I actually attended his funeral because 28 years ago I was working in London Bath, Greenwich, and I got a call at 9:30 in the morning that another Black young man had been murdered. And this happened 18 months after the murder of Roland Adams on the Thamesmead estate. And when I went to his funeral, and actually I was standing outside, but one of the youth workers that I managed dragged me into the church and I stood at the back. But I along with all the hundreds of other people that were crammed in the church, walked past his coffin to pay respects. So I actually saw him, I'd never met him before, but I actually saw him in his coffin. And the reason why I say that, because after that, after the Macpherson report, a few years later, the police service, which were actually found to be institutionally racist, they responded in a number of ways. And one of the ways they responded was through equal opportunities training. So I actually trained West Yorkshire Police for many months in equal ops training. And then during this period, we've also moved from equal ops training into cultural diversity, into other kinds of training, such as, oh gosh, my brain, just in terms of sort of conscious bias. Thank goodness I've never run that training course, but I have run many equal opportunities training programs over the decades. And why I'm saying this is because actually they made very, very, very little difference in terms of really pushing and stretching the system in the way that it needed to be. And given the age that I am, I can remember and was heavily involved in anti-racist training in the very early 80s, when white people would come out of those sessions quite shell-shocked, but actually committed to change. And as we know, you can't have change without friction. I think the time that we have now has created a lot of friction, and it needs to be sustained. Ubele isn't a new organisation. We've been around for 10 years plus, but actually we're one of the many thousands of Black-led organisations that have actually surfaced during this period. We were hidden under bushel. The lights were not shone on us. We were there busy doing the work that was needed, but the wider system chose to ignore us. And Ubele is taken from Swahili. It means the way ahead or the future. And yeah, we were relatively unknown before COVID, but actually through the work we've done with others and by ourselves in the system of last year, we've become relatively well known. And just a bit about who we are. Many of us come from professional community development backgrounds. So Ubele is a bit different because we are based in communities. We have community sites that we support. We run a community site in Wood Green. We see ourselves as a catalyst organisation. We provide infrastructure, but also we provide incubation projects and direct action in communities. So just a bit about the funding field, and I don't want to go into the state of what it was prior to COVID, but we know. Actually, what I did do was I wasn't looking for it, but I found an application that I wrote over 5 years ago for a Black Women's Leadership Programme. We were only asking for £13,000, and I read it 5 years later, and I would have funded it, and we were denied and rejected as an application. So it's not that we know we're producing really excellent applications over the last many years, but actually we've been denied access to funding. So I'm just going to touch on six areas very briefly. And of course, there are many, many more. During this past year and a bit, we've actually got and collected and undertaken a lot of intelligence gathering. So I would suggest we don't need any more intelligence. We knew before, and we certainly have known in the last year and a bit. We know what time of day it is. We know what the impact of COVID's been on our communities. We know what the lack of resourcing and support has done to our communities. Runnymede Trust, Equally Ours, Future Foundation, Voice for Change, Baobab, they've all helped us see ourselves more clearly than we had done previously, and for others to see us as well. So we don't need any more intelligence gathering. We actually need sustained action. The data that we've collected, and not only through the broader research, but also when we've actually been involved in programs of funding, have been useful if we use them at the point of, not at the end when we see what we've done, but we use them to shape and inform what actually happened as we're doing it, when we're in flow. Because actually it's too late to say we've given all the money and oh dear, we didn't quite reach the groups that we wanted to. Work we've been doing with social investment business around data collection and using that to actually shape programs as we've gone along, such as clause, have been really helpful because we can stop and say, hold on a minute, what are we doing here? Are we getting the results that we actually set ourselves to get, or actually do we need to change the program midstream for another round in order to make sure that we actually engage with the groups that we want to engage and we fund the groups we want to fund. So I would suggest intelligence, we don't need any more of that, but we do need data that tracks what's going on as it's actually happening. The whole design of systems, who builds them then controls them, okay? And at least they know why they're building it. And one of the things that's happened in the past year and a bit is that, being around the table, not just to make the decisions at the end, but being in the design phase is really, really important. I mean, we've been working with London Community Response Fund Equity Partners Group, for example, to kind of really push London funders, and there's about 60 of them in the London system. So it's a huge group of funders that we're actually been involved in, but actually to make sure that they design and redesign and keep redesigning programs so that we get more equitable outcomes. There's also one other area that we've been working on, which is about influencing the wider system. So meeting with funders, speaking at conferences, writing about issues, Charity So White, Phoenix Way, all the things that we've been doing around trying to influence, I think has had some impact. I think there's a need to find a broader range of voices to be speaking out to ourselves and to funders about what's happening. I'm still yet to see a young Black man speak at an event about funding and what's happened and what they should be happening more importantly. I mean, I think over the last 2 days, I wasn't at the Runnymede Trust conference yesterday. I'm not sure who was there, but I'm talking about under 35s. I'm not talking about, those people who've been around a long time and a season. We need different voices influencing the system. I just want to say one last thing about an area of funding, and that is the Phoenix Fund. And that's been an interesting process, which is Black-led, has led to identifying and showing and surfacing Black leadership, Black excellence. We gave away over 2 million, and we're currently in discussions with the lottery about a much larger fund, hopefully for later this year, focusing on micro and small groups, because the majority of our groups are actually have turnovers of less than £50,000. Just a couple of things I wanted to say in conclusion. I've noticed during the last year, as the funding system has opened up, that there's now a change in the conversation and trying to get Black and minoritized groups involved in social investment. Social investment means taking risk. It means securing loans. Not a bad thing in itself, because it means with those loans, we can secure assets and long-term investments in our communities. However, given the majority of our groups are micro and small and have not been involved in the social investment field, we are, I think, some 3 to 5 years away from being social investment ready, because we've just not had the support in terms of looking at what the opportunities are to buy housing or to buy community spaces or to buy land and grow. Great opportunities for community wealth building, but we're not round that table as yet, and we need to get supported to be round there. The Baobab Fund, I just want to say something about that, because we're being asked, how is the Phoenix Fund different from the Baobab Fund? You know, what is it that you do? Why can't you just have one fund? And I'm like, hell no, we're not going to have one fund. You've got an ecosystem of funders and philanthropists and organizations that give money with different priorities, similar and overlapping priorities. And actually, we need to have the same. So if we've got 2 funds, Phoenix Fund and Baobab, well, you know, we're just beginning. So you're going to have to ask that question again, but we'll tell you, actually, we've got a whole ecosystem of funding and support to build for our communities. We've only just begun. And then just in terms of BUSCA papers, which Natalie is going to actually present you with in terms of calls to action, we produced them because we felt that we needed the sector voice. We needed, as Black and minoritized community, to tell funders what we actually need. We didn't want to be waiting to be told what we should have, which has been partly what's happened during the last year, although there have been partnerships which have kind of, as I said, pushed that to some extent. But actually, we felt that our voice needed to be out there very clearly. The BUSCA papers makes an attempt at doing that. It's taken a number of months to develop, and we spoke with funders, but also we spoke with our sector. There are a number of calls to action, which Natalie will talk you through and that you'll get a chance to speak about. But we actually want people to sign up. It's a call to action. For white-led organisations, it might seem quite straight talking. It's not a flowery academic piece of research, although it does have references in it. It's actually a straight talking, clear-cut piece of work, which is a position paper. It's a position paper that says what we need them to do going forward, and that we will hold them to account. So yeah, COVID-19 has allowed us to reset the button. As somebody said over a year ago to me, we shouldn't shy away from this opportunity because it might feel too hard. And as I said, we can't have change without friction. So let's go for it. And I'm passing over to Natalie. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Yvonne. My name is Natalie, and I'm a program manager at the Awojobi Initiative. I joined in the middle of the pandemic and instantly was inspired by what Yvonne was dealing with at the time, and Michael, our other director, and what they've continued to do throughout a pandemic. Just to give a little bit of context into the way that Awojobi works as well, is that we're an intergenerational organisation, and working in this way has not only demonstrated how much there is to be learned from the generation before, but also how these conversations are not new. I second Yvonne, this is not about acquiring more intelligence because we have it. I also want to honour the Brixton uprisings and the people with lived experience from that time to now, where we see a global response to Black Lives Matter. A year on from George Floyd's death, we will be looking at how funding has changed in the past year, and what's in store for it next. Looking forward, we decided to interview people from the sector. I did 12 interviews with funders and over 14 interviews with BAME infrastructure, intermediary and grassroots bodies from up and down the country that are led by Black and minoritized communities. In these interviews, we took the time to listen. We took the time to have conversations about what their experiences were, and then spent even longer to unpack all of that and pull out the main insights of what we were told. As Yvonne mentions, we've written a paper called Buska. Buska means position in Somalian. This is a collective voice from the sector. What we've shown you, I believe it's been shared in the chat, there's a list of call to actions. This has not come from any one person. This is a collective voice. This is a response to what we have heard and what information has come into us. We've kept people anonymous so they could feel safe to really open up what's going on in the sector without being afraid of losing funding. It's going to be launched next week with the report, the full report. And I'm going to go ahead and read some of these call to actions with you now. Bear with me. I'm going to go to the, sorry, let me just go to the top. So if you work through the document, we're going to use this as a tool for the rest of the workshop. So I invite you to open it and download it if you haven't already. It should be available even if you're watching back. The first one is addressing racism requires sustained long-term investment. A lot of the feedback that we got was that funding is about to run out or it needs to be renewed for another cycle. The fear is that this might have been short-term performative funding in response to Black Lives Matter as opposed to long-term investment. The second thing is, in light of the recent report by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, funders should now recognise that putting Black and minoritized people in positions doesn't automatically equate to being anti-racist. In fact, the strength of institutional racism is such they may knowingly go against the interests of their own community in an effort to sustain their own livelihood as an individual by a system that actively supports and rewards them for doing so. This particular slide, you can go into the questions, are questions that we offer for you to ask about whether some of your practices are anti-racist or not. These are all open questions and I invite you to maybe delve into them further. These are aimed at funders, by the way, also, just to clarify. The next one is around intersectionality, which has to be taken into account if you want to reach Black and minoritized women, LGBTQI people, disabled people, and those who face additional structural oppression, including institutional racism. Ring-fence funding for Black and minoritized people-led organizations is a positive start. However, it still heightens competition within that group without the criteria being made any lower for those who are more marginalized. Number 4, if funders rely only on the insights from academic and white-led research, they will fail to see the full and true picture. Whilst academic research has a place in knowledge generation, such research should consider decolonizing methods and approaches. Building sustainable research capacity in the sector in this way builds capacity for funding decisions to be made with the appropriate knowledge and context. What we did find in this report are organisations that have researched communities from a Black feminist point of view, for example, are now understanding the context for women. For example, when we interviewed an organisation that deals with Black and minoritized women, the demand on services through the COVID period went up to 300% and 75% of women were being turned away. In order to capture that data, you have to be understanding where women are in the picture as well, for example, and that goes for other marginalised groups in the sector as well. It's commonly misunderstood that you either have to be a race or another marginalised group. We are both. Number 5, exclusion takes many forms and is a harmful experience for Black and minoritized people to go through in social and professional networks that eventually erodes their health, well-being, and eventually life expectancy. Funders building their own networks and relationships with more people in the sector to build and nurture trusting relationships fosters a much more open dialogue. This call to action is about changing a transactional relationship with the community to a relational one. It's about speaking to people and listening to people and building trust. It's not a case of assuming without asking. Number 6, we hear of rejections more than we do of success with achieving funding from our community. This has a devastating effect on confidence for community groups to go back and reapply. Publishing data about the application process is just one aspect. We need to understand who is being turned down and for what reasons for funders to demonstrate accountability. This is based honestly on everything that we heard. We do hear of positive actions, which are great, but we also hear of a lot of people getting turned down. The impact of this is pretty devastating when groups and organisations and individuals who apply for funding also experience institutional racism in their everyday lives. We call this in the paper a crisis of confidence, and it's something that we all can do something about. Number 7. The gaslighting of Black and minoritized people has been intensified to an even stronger degree by the recent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities by the UK government. In this sector, too many Black and minoritized community organisations are receiving feedback that the reason that they're not getting the funding they need is because their applications just aren't good enough. We need to shift this narrative. Racial gaslighting across all institutions in society means Black and minoritized people are already suffering a crisis of confidence from being made to feel that they don't deserve funding, even when they need it. Validate their needs and respond to the value of social good that they address that have fallen through the structures that should have been there for them in the first place. One of the most horrible things about doing this research is hearing how many people are filling gaps for basic needs that should be provided by government for Black and minoritized communities. This work is often unpaid, it's often unrecognised. And when people are applying for funding for this, if it's not being seen as innovative or new, they're not getting the funding, they're being told that they're not good enough. People filling basic needs in this country that are not being met shouldn't be treated in this way. Number 8, despite the common experience of racism of all Black and minoritized communities, the same mindset that regards everyone as BAME means people are often pitted against one another in competition for the limited ring fence for resources available. London-centric narratives mean that even fewer resources are available for communities outside of London to share between them. This fuels toxic competition. This particular call to action is about changing that to collaboration instead of competition. And there's a few other mechanisms that Yvonne talked about that we've also mentioned here for people to consider new ways of working. And the last one, prove your legitimacy by publishing and demonstrating how you are taking accountability for where your money comes from. This one is often, well, we see it also as a response to people often ask, where do you come from, to communities who are Black or minoritized. We want to flip that and ask, where's your money coming from? Because the history involves everybody. And we just want to ask the same question back. Where is your money coming from? It's as simple as that. Thank you for listening to all of these. Now I've run through them, I'm going to stop sharing and trust, yes, and trust that you all have been able to download the document. The next thing that we're going to do is put you into groups for the exercise part of this seminar. Once we put you into groups, everybody is going to be discussing one of these call to actions. Thank you. My colleagues have put it in the chat. You're able to open these documents and have a look at sort of like how we've constructed this workshop. I want to say a couple of things before we do this. The first thing is that there is lots of roadblocks to this conversation that we're having right now. These topics are not necessarily complex, they are, but that's not what makes them difficult to talk about. What makes them difficult to talk about are the emotional responses that they evoke and the trauma that becomes active when you speak about them. It's also about managing feelings of guilt, shame, anger, hurt, and more. These are the things that people find really, really difficult to sit with and work through and have conversations about. This is why we're giving you enough time to observe those. And we invite you also, if you're experiencing anything and you want to write that down separately so that you can have the conversation that is difficult, then we really do encourage you to do that. The other thing is about mindset. And I just want to make it clear from a personal point of view, having heard a lot of different funders speak as well, that having more power in the UK, whether that be financial networks, political, state power, weapons, assets, whatever, does not make you superior. Being able to decide as the haves who gets what of the have-nots is often mistakenly accredited to intelligence, skills, or ability. I just want everyone to imagine how different that could be if it was accredited to listening skills. Ideas of superiority and inferiority are rooted in colonization that still has effects that foster toxic and harmful relationships to this day. Martha mentioned earlier about interpersonal, and this is where we see it show up. If you open the Google Docs link, it will be accessible to everybody afterwards. You're going to join a breakout room that is named after one of the call to actions. In this breakout room, you're going to discuss the questions related to this call to action that you've been assigned and come up with some possible actions. These are the things that we would like you to think about. Are you doing this already? That's number one. How can you get there if you're not? Bearing in mind, as I mentioned earlier, some of the roadblocks that we face are just how challenging the conversation itself is in itself. What is the time frame? Often we find people have the best intentions, but in order to make that an outcome, you have to plan, you have to have a time frame, and you have to think about how long it's going to take you to get there. This is not indefinite. There are ways to measure outcomes, as we've outlined. How will you remain accountable? This is a really important one. Thinking about the last slide as well. We understand that people are accountable to a board, but how are you accountable to the communities that you are supposed to be reaching? If you've exhausted the conversation, which I would be amazed if you do, because there's a lot in there in every single slide, then you're more than welcome to pick up another one and discuss those in your groups as well. I think that's it from me. Okay, I'm now going to give it over to Martha, who is the tech expert. And we're going to hope that this works.
I like this new title that I've been given. Right, I have set up breakout rooms. They are at random. There should be about 5 people in each room, so you can have a really intimate discussion. Each room will be named one of the calls to action. As Natalie said, I'm going to open the breakout rooms now. You'll be automatically moved into them in a minute, or you can click if you get excited and want to move 30 seconds earlier. We'll come back at around 10 to, so that we can kind of close. Yeah, okay, I'm opening rooms. I hope everybody feels confident knowing what they're doing and has the document. I will see you in half an hour. Hello.
Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, so, well, we're not going to ask you to report back on your conversations. Hopefully they were deep, challenging, fruitful, encouraging, thoughtful conversations. Certainly the group that I was in, it was small, there were just 4 of us, but actually we were looking at the application process amongst other things. So we've captured, hopefully Christina, who I can see in front of me now, has captured some of the main sort of thoughts. And 2 things that came up. One was just the power of partnerships, actually. And I sort of touched on it very briefly when I sort of, spoke earlier in the workshop. But actually, it's not just partnerships with funders, but partnerships between ourselves as organizations, whether it's at very local level, whether it's a regional level, or whether it's at the national level, because we need to have voice and influence. And, the way that we can do it is, and I think somebody wrote this earlier, but it's actually about being more than the sum of the parts. So actually, we need to really find ways to collaborate with each other and to build those partnerships so we can have a really strong voice. And the other thing that came up was around support. So it's not just the money, although we want the money because it is our money. As Natalie said, we need to be asking, where does the money come from? But we actually know what the answers are. But actually, the funding plus the support to help organizations really develop and become strong and to grow is something also that needs to go alongside the funding as we move forward. So the Busca paper and the call to action calls to action will be published next week. Natalie, you have a Google document that you're asking people to sign up to, is that right?
Yes, we have
Okay.
a Google form that we're going to share. If you are, I mean, anyone can sign it because it's going to have the options. But if you feel that these call to actions are something that you agree with, or something that you would like to add your organization's name to, please do. I'm just going to find the Google Doc, bear with me. I'm going to find a way to put it in the chat so that you can just fill that form out. We're collecting names at the moment. And once the report is published next week, there will still be an open call for adding your name. So if you don't do it today, or you can think of an organization that would want to be a part of this and isn't here today, that's fine. It will still be open next week, so we can get as much power behind these call to actions from the sector as possible.
Thank you. So you'll hopefully put the link in a moment. And what we're intending to do, because the calls to action are to the funders, we want them to transform, we want them to actually to provide more equitable funding outcomes. We want them to actually create partnerships that really make a difference. That we will be hosting a roundtable discussion with funders to see what developments and what's happened to those calls to action within 6 months of launching them. So we'll be trying to hold them to account by actually asking them to sign up to these, to include them in their strategic plans over the next 6 months, but we'll also be asking them to join a roundtable discussion later this year, so we can actually try and measure progress made. And if there are blockages, then to explore what they are and what needs to happen next. So that's what we're doing as a commitment from the calls to action that are going to be published next week. Okay, so I'm going to pass back to Martha and Annie to conclude the workshop, but it's been really great seeing you all here this morning. So thank you for joining us. Martha and Annie, would you like to have the closing words?
Thank you, Yvonne and Natalie and everyone here for participating and having those really challenging conversations. You know, after these sessions, there's always a huge rush of excitement and motivation to just do something. And that's really great. You know, facilitators for these kinds of sessions will get sent feedback about how great these sessions were, followed by a "can I pick your brain?" This is a bad habit that we need to break. Our experiences, knowledge, and emotional labour should be compensated. So before you make that request, make sure that you've got the fee to follow it up. Right now, instead of taking that energy into asking us to pick our brains, we want you to channel your energy into your networks. Take these asks to your networks, have the hard conversations, and encourage them to grow, just as we have done for you today. We don't need innovation, we need to be heard. In this room, you have committed to making a long-term change to the system. That starts by centering those voices and using these calls to action to shape what your strategy is. Return agency to the people that you're serving and see them as equals, not beneficiaries. At Charity So White, our impetus has always been that we don't want to burn down the sector, we want to improve it. And that's exactly what you're here to do. I will let Martha say the closing words now.
I feel really privileged to have the final words. I've really enjoyed the session, and actually I feel like I've been learning alongside everybody else. So yeah, it's really a privilege to be sharing this proverbial stage with Ubalé Initiative. Funders have been speaking about their commitments to equity. They've been asking community leaders how they can change their practice. And as we've been saying, now is the time for action. This is about achieving mission. It's not about looking good. It's not about gathering more evidence. It is about delivering your organizational mission. If you are tackling inequality, then an anti-racist analysis is vital to doing your work properly. If you are strengthening communities, then an anti-racist analysis is vital to doing your work properly. And we've given you all the tools in our calls to actions today. Funders, it is your responsibility to ensure that the world that we are rebuilding after COVID-19 and beyond is anti-racist. You have the power, you have the resource. Do not shy away from it, and don't shy away from the responsibility that comes from that power. You should be leading the way. You should be collecting your people, influencing your peers. You should be showing us what you are made of, showing us the world as it could be. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, that's the end of our session.
Thank you, and thank you so much to Charity So White as well. We've had a really great productive session to be able to collaborate together in this way.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Okay, so we're actually 3 minutes early, but I'm sure those of you who are going on to another workshop might actually you know, quite like a 2-minute break before you join another workshop during the conference day. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for being with us.